Alright everybody, welcome to my next big video. Today I'm going to be talking about the magic of the four ancient elements. For those of you who have never heard of those before, those are the elements of earth, air, water, and fire. You'd be surprised how many people, when I'm doing readings for people, I'll mention that the tarot it has to do with the four elements. And I say, of course you know what the four elements are, and they go, no, I don't think I know what you're talking about. And then I go, earth, air, fire, and water. And they're like, oh, okay. I didn't realize you were talking about something so simple. Yes, they are the elements. That is the simplest possible way that we can talk about the universe. And in fact, the ancients believed that the universe was basically constructed from these four elements. Now, they weren't specifically the physical objects of fire, water, air, and earth, but rather the subtle concepts that are constructed out of these things. And I'll get to that in a second. But so we can actually still continue to view the world as constructed from these four elements without really being in any kind of contradiction with modern science. The only difference is that in modern science we use a different element for a different world, which is the basic compounds that are atomic structures that are specifically like iron and lead and gold and neon and those sorts of things. The specific particles that make up the various substances. Those are also called elements. But however, the elements themselves are still present in a number of ways in our universe in a very practical sense. First of all, the ancients, the way that they conceived of the elements was that in their most pure form, the element of earth merely meant dryness. The element of water really meant wetness. The element of air really meant warmness. No, I'm sorry. The element of water meant coolness. The element of air meant dryness. And I'm mixing these up now. It's the combinations that are important. Okay, so the element of fire meant heat. We know that. The element of air meant must have meant moisture. The element, no, because this has to be moisture. Anyway, in their purest form, it was one subject. But as they actually began to manifest, then the air becomes, the fire becomes dryness and heat. Air becomes moisture and heat. Water becomes moisture and cold, and earth becomes cold and dryness. So in those basic forms, that is the simplest way that we can look at the elements. Now, because of that, those qualities still exist and still form a part of everything that exists in the universe. So we can say that the four elements are not disproven. They're just simply more subjective, more metaphysical concepts rather than the actual object. In Buddhism, there's actually a slightly different take on the four elements that I think is also equally valid. And in that, fire represents temperature in general, the warmth or coolness of something. Water represents volume in general, the shape of things. Air represents motion, the way that things move in the world. And earth represents mass, the heaviness of things. And that also describes the real world in a practical sense, and in a sense of in an experiential sense. Our what we are actually experiencing of those elements. Whether we're experiencing things as being warmer or cooler, whether we're experiencing them as being vibratory, or whether we're experiencing them as heavy, or whether we're experiencing them as massive or small. These are all things that we actually experience in our lives. And so the Buddhist idea of the four elements, which they also believe that, or the Buddha actually believed that the universe was created from these things in exactly the same way. Franz Barden suggests some alternate meanings for the four elements as well that are also interesting, with fire representing expansion, water representing contraction, air representing lightness, and earth representing heaviness. Now, these are fairly similar to the Buddhist ideas, but I just thought I'd mention those as well. So, and again, those are simple qualities of existence that are still there. The four elements form an important part of the philosophical discussion of how the universe is created. Most creation stories, at some point or another, will mention the elements as they're coming into being. You know, the fire was placed here, the water was placed here, the air was placed here, the earth was placed here. They're discussed as being sort of fundamental to the way that the world was created. They don't really find a huge place in practical magic. We see them in philosophical discussions going all the way back to 2,000 years ago and more, and we see them discussed in their occult terms in Agrippa. We see them in Paracelsus. We see them in the work of Mesmer. We see them in a number of different places within the earlier occult writings, but we don't see them being used for a lot of practical magic. When we look at practical magic, we more see the planets being used as the sort of the directional forces. For instance, there's a lot of images that are related to either one of the planets or to one of the mansions of the moon, but there aren't really ones associated with the four elements in that time period. The exception to that is that there are a lot of images that are associated with the astrological signs, and there are a number of them for each of the astrological signs, which are elemental, but they're not specifically the four elements. It's a very modern thing that we see actual practical magical stuff around the four elements. We see it a lot in modern witchcraft, but I think with all due respect to Wicca and that movement in general, I think it actually comes from the Golden Dawn, who drew it actually from the Dr. Rudd Enochian materials, where they had taken the D4 watchtowers and turned it into an elemental system. Interestingly enough, John Dee does talk about the four elements a little bit or his angels talk to him about the four elements in the practical magic of his Enochian system, but it's only the bottom right subquadrant of each of the watchtowers contains the angel names of the four elements, and the four watchtowers represent four different directions, but they don't specifically name the watchtowers as being related to the elements. That's a later element to the program. Excuse me for creating an unintentional pun. An element to the program that was added, like I said, by some group, or Elias Ashmole or Dr. Rudd or somewhere along the line. It kind of got moved into a more elemental direction. And now, if you look at a lot of modern magical works, the Enochian system is all about the four elements at this point. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. I know a lot of people have become very sort of fundamentalist about their approach to things that are older than a couple hundred years, and they say, no, you have to do it exactly the way that they did it. I think that magic, it's okay if it evolves, and the amount of magic that's been done around the Enochian system utilizing those elemental qualities is massive, and the amount of magic that's been done with it in the classical way, making sure that you have the holy table made out of sweet wood that's exactly 36 inches in every direction and all that kind of stuff, that there have been very few people who've practically done that. But there have been very many people who've done a lot of magical work with the watchtowers as elemental gateways. That's not to say that either way is right or wrong. They're just two different approaches to the thing. It's interesting because Aaron Leach is a friend of mine, and he wrote a book called The Essential Enochian Grimoire, and he told me that basically he didn't really want to write anything about the Neo-Enochian, even though he is an adept of the Golden Dawn. He just wanted to write about the classic Enochian stuff, but his publisher actually said, we want you to write a full, as full a presentation as possible. So the whole Neo-Enochian stuff is something that he was asked to include. And I think he did a good job of it, because he actually, as I said, he's actually kind of an expert in it as an adept of the Golden Dawn who teaches the stuff to people. So even though he doesn't personally do that much of it. I don't think that that particular style. I can't say for sure in ritual temple space he may do quite a lot. I'm not saying he doesn't, but I just know his heart is with the more classical version of it. The Golden Dawn utilizes the four elements in a lot of ways, particularly in its grade structure. There are a lot of aspects of the four elements that are incorporated into it, and in modern Golden Dawn schools, they'll actually really focus on that in a pretty profound way. In the older Golden Dawn, it was more intellectual knowledge and just sort of discussed. But in more modern Golden Dawn groups, they'll actually they'll have you learn geomancy as a zealotor, which is the one that's associated with the element of earth, because that's the earth divination system, and so on and so forth. So. The Golden Dawn uses the elements in a somewhat practical way, although still, again, when you get to sort of talismanic magic, you still end up doing a lot more with the planets and with the zodiac and so forth than you do with the four elements. Franz Bardon, in his work in the sort of early to mid 20th century, focuses heavily on those four elements and utilizes them in a much more practical way than you see in the Golden Dawn or anyone previous to him. His idea of the four elements is very sort of central, and actually I believe comes from Mesmer's work and other magnetic schools, which I believe he was a part of, because there's some indications of that in his writings that you see in these German and Germanic occult writings. You'll see some stuff about the four elements that you don't see elsewhere, and I think that comes a lot through the Paracelsus and Mesmer track of things into the Bardon stuff. Now, a lot of people are sort of anti-Bardon at this point. As I said, I think because we're sort of leaning more and more back towards the older writings, and Bardon's work is fairly modern in its tone, even though it's a bit dry in its translation. But it focuses a lot on consciousness. It focuses a lot on how your mind creates images and so forth, and that stuff isn't as present in the grimoires. So people who are very grimoire in their focus tend to sort of dismiss it. But I think it is some interesting and powerful stuff if you care to begin to explore with it. After that, we get into the modern witchcraft and so forth that utilizes it in a way that is probably the most practical in some ways, because they are utilizing it because they're wanting to have an earth-based religion, and those four elements become very significant in their spiritual structure because of the fact that there are somewhat earth-based concepts. My work, The New Hermetics, focuses a lot on the four elements as well, and also the fifth element, the quintessence, the element of spirit or ether, largely because of those previous things, and that was what I was trained in, and so that's kind of where my natural thinking went with those things. In some ways, I think that I've kind of gone past where others have gone, just because I've included a lot of different sorts of work that you don't really see in other places. My work, let me just get to my notes here. I'm working from notes because I could just go on about this forever, and I want to make sure that I don't speak for literally the rest of our lives on this subject. In New Hermetics, there are essentially three different kinds of tools within the New Hermetics toolbox. Really, when I created New Hermetics, it was really just a set of tools and an idea for approaching tools in a way that we can create practical sort of step-by-step instructions to recreate a lot of these metaphysical things and get rid of some of the rigmarole and just kind of focus in on the consciousness aspect of it, which I guess is probably an influence from Bardon in some ways, also an influence from Crowley, who was very interested in sort of like sweeping away that which is unnecessary and focusing on what actually works. But there are three basic categories. One of them is sort of personal development things, and these are largely sort of NLP-based things. Mystical tools, which are tools that are designed to sort of connect you with higher consciousness, just to expand consciousness without a specific purpose in mind, and then specifically magical tools, which are designed to actually help you operate and to make a change in your life, in what, either directly into the outer world or in yourself, but in a magical sense. So to look at the four elements through that lens, if you look at my work, the element of earth is covered by the practice of goal setting, and also taking specific actions in your life to accomplish things, both actions towards goals that you've set, but also specific things like charging your food and your water, and breathing exercises that are designed to focus your attention on in various different ways. In personal development, we've got the water element is covered by the various exercises that I have for changing your emotional state, and for moving from negative emotional states into positive emotional states, creating anchors for various positive emotional states, those sorts of things. The element of air is the beliefs, the exercises for both defining your beliefs, understanding where your limiting beliefs are affecting you, and actually going through and consciously changing those beliefs through various specific mental technologies. And fire is your values, and by values I mean those things that you actually go after, the things that you desire, the things that you want. And again, the specific tools within the New Hermetics are designed to help you to focus on what that hierarchy is, and then to go in and change those things that are less desirable towards things that are more desirable. Like very, very often people find that they actually desire to watch television more than they desire to write their book, even though writing their book is something that they, on a certain level, they have a hierarchy of having it up here on a meaning level, but on a practical, actual level, they have it down here. So I've got tools that are designed specifically to help you kind of shift those things around. So those are personal development. As far as mystical, for the earth element, my exercise for balancing the four elements is a mystical tool designed to help you to kind of move your elemental character flaws in different directions. And it actually kind of is on the borderline between personal development and mystical, but it has a very salutary effect upon your character and your consciousness. So I do consider it to be a spiritual tool. For water, I've got chakra opening exercises that are pretty standard exercises at this point within the a lot of spiritual exercises that are out there. I think mine, one of the things that I can say about my tools is that they actually kind of work, and they help you to really focus in on those areas and to understand that they are the same areas where you're feeling the emotional stuff, and moving them and changing the direction and flow of your energies through those areas. For the element of air, expanding your consciousness to fill the universe, which is actually based on a technique from Aleister Crowley. There's a Liber based on it, which I'm not going to try and pronounce right now. The element of fire, we've got rising on the plains, and then magical. For magical, we've got, for the element of earth, we've got action, because the most important magical thing that you can do is to make a connection between whatever it is that you're willing and what it is that you actually want to have happen. So by taking an action, you are grounding what you're doing and creating that circuit. Now, that's true if you're creating a talisman. You're already kind of doing that in the material world, but it's still, even if you've created a talisman, it's a really good idea to take that talisman with you and then move to the spot where the actual thing that you want to have occurring happens, and to do something there. That's a very critical aspect of magic that is left out. We see it a lot in more ancient forms. If you look at like old witchcraft recipes, or things from African American hoodoo, you see where they take the stuff, they take the work, and they put it into the path of where the person is going to be walking, or they touch the person with it in some way. The least effective is if they have something from that person and they involve it in the thing, and they don't actually interact with them physically, but at least they're still making that connection on some subtle level with the power of contagion and connection. But that action is highly important. For the element of water, magical stuff within the New Hermetics is creating synchronicities and just sort of using visualization and emotional energy to put into where you want things to go. For the magic of air, we've got charging spaces with energy and creating artificial elementals. And for the element of fire, we've got invoking higher consciousness of various higher powers. So that's just a sort of a brief sort of ramble about how within my new Hermetic system, we've got all the 4 elements all have a specific kind of a magical, mystical, and personal development kind of energy that you can track each one, and throughout the first 4 levels, that's basically what we're doing is working through these various energies and how to utilize them best. And then what I like to say to people is that it's best for you to kind of go through those levels to learn those things, and then once you get to the 5th level, at the level of spirit, that's when you begin to kind of integrate all those things and to actually bring them into practical usefulness. Before that, you're really just learning to utilize the tool. But once you have all the tools, once you've got all the 4 elements in your toolbox, you can then really use them in the most practical way. Stepping back into general occultism, we see the 4 elements in historical occultism in a few important ways. First and foremost, we see them in the 12 signs of the zodiac. There are 3 signs associated with each of the elements. For instance, we've got Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius that are associated with the element of fire. I'm not going to go through all of them, but each of the elements has 3 signs associated with it, and they've got 3 kind of different flavors of the element associated with them. For instance, Aries is the hot intensity of fire. Leo is the constant force of fire, and Sagittarius is sort of the waning flame of the spiritualized flame of fire. And that goes through all of the 4 elements and all of the 12 signs of the zodiac. And I'm going to probably talk a little bit more about each element in a future broadcast. I'll probably have 4 broadcasts in the future about each one of the elements. I'm not going to do that immediately because I don't want to beat the 4 elements to death, but I will get back to this subject and focus a little bit more on each one as we move forward. Also, we see in Magick the Tetragrammaton, the name of God Yahweh or Jehovah or Yod-He-Vav-He. This sacred name actually is associated with the 4 elements, with the initial Yod being associated with the element of fire, the first He being associated with the element of water, the Vav in the middle being associated with the element of air, and the final He being associated with the element of earth. Interestingly, in Kabbalah, in the Sefer Yetzirah, there's actually no space given for earth. Earth is just considered to be the sort of result, and only the first 3 elements are actually discussed in detail. And another little interesting tidbit on that particular subject is that Plato created the 5 Platonic solids, with the tetrahedron being associated with fire, the octahedron being associated with air, and the icosahedron being associated with water. All 3 of those are made up of triangles, of equilateral triangles in various shapes. The element of earth is sort of left to the side, which is made up, which is a cube in his system. So again, we see that the first 3 elements, fire, air, and water, are kind of given a different kind of an energy than the earth, which is the result of those things. Although in a lot of Platonic and other philosophers that were either influenced by him or related to his work in one way or another, they actually did believe that the elements could switch from one to the other, so that earth could become fire and air could be, they could basically go back and forth. And that's obviously, we can see that if we take water, we can put it through all those different phases, except it doesn't actually become fire, but it disappears into nothingness in the heat of the sun, basically. So we can see them, basically all going back and forth in between the states of matter. The formula of Yod-He-Vav-He is also interesting. Aleister Crowley writes of it and basically says that it's the most important formula of magic, and the formula of invocation. in which he says that the element of fire is the swift flow of will that you are throwing out into the universe as you're beginning your magical invocations. The element of water is the next phase of consciousness in that, in which there's just a flow of that will that completely goes forward. The element of air represents an expansion of your consciousness out into the universe, and the element of earth represents the crystallization of all that force into the talisman or into the Eucharist or whatever it is that you're creating with your magical operation. And that, of course, is particularly related to sexual magic, but also any other kind of magic as well will have those basic forces flowing through it. And he mentions that basically at any of those points before the last one, something can go wrong. If you want to read about that, check out the book Magic in Theory and Practice by Aleister Crowley. Additionally, and this is again a somewhat modern addition to magic, but it goes back several hundred years, and that is that the 4 elemental weapons were associated with the 4 elements, and hence the 4 suits of the tarot. Now, in more modern times, there are some people who will have the sword represent the element of fire and the wand represent the element of air. But in the tarot, except for really modern decks that utilize those modern attributions that were created by various Wiccan groups, it is actually the wand is fire, the sword is air, the cup is water, and the pentacle or disc is earth. These are also symbolic of aspects of the magician's consciousness, with the fire representing the magician's will, the air representing the magician's intellect, the water representing the magician's understanding and intuition and emotional forces, and the earth representing the magician's body. So, and that each of those are basically the actual elemental weapons, of which the symbolic weapons that you use in your rituals are meant to be representing. I mentioned the tarot card thing. So I mean, if you're a witch or a neo-pagan who has associated the sword with air and the wand with, I'm sorry, I can't even say it, the sword with fire and the wand with air, I don't want to take away from your beliefs and the way that you do things, but that it's not the way that most of occultism does things, but that's fine. I do some things different too. And maybe you're right. So before I leave the topic of practical magic that can be done, I want to just mention a couple of other sort of listy things that I've got here. And I've got a few questions that people asked about the 4 elements, but not a whole bunch. So basically, if you're going to utilize the elements as a magical source of power, there are a number of different specific kinds of magic that you can do with each one. For instance, the element of fire you can use for rituals that are designed to either to create passion or to create desire or to create intensity, either in yourself or somebody else. It can be used in rituals that are designed to create success or to create domination and accomplishment. They can be used specifically for sex-related operations, for obtaining sex or for improving your sexual prowess, enhancing your creativity, developing strength and will. So those are just some of the things that you can do with the element of fire in terms of a practical use of that fire energy in a ritual. The element of water can be used for attracting people to emotionally attracting people to you, creating friendships, creating love relationships that are deeper than sex. They can be used for creating tranquility, for creating calmness, for creating peace, for creating emotional and spiritual well-being, calming, changing emotions, and improving your understanding, improving your wisdom. That comes from the hay and Aleister Crowley's formula there. The element of air can be used practically for things to do with education, things to do with your mind, your intellect, things to do with your job, your function in the world on an intellectual level. It can do with learning and teaching, organization, developing new skills, encouraging movement and travel and those sorts of things. And the element of water can actually be used for travel too, as a traditionally water is associated with travel because people, long journeys were traditionally done in the water. So the element of earth can be utilized for practical matters, bringing things down to earth, bringing things into actualization, getting a job, getting money, getting investments, getting building things, creating buildings, getting a home, getting a new apartment, getting a new place, improving your physical appearance, improving your physical body. All of those things can do with the element of earth. So and how you do that, there are a number of different ways in which you can approach that. The simplest way is just simply to connect with that element, to create an intention of what you want to do, connect with that elemental energy just simply by realizing that it's all around us, that the heat and dryness of the fire, the temperature, the expansive energy of fire is ever present in all things. And so in lesser and greater amounts, it's present in our bodies, it's present in every object that's around us. And so by associating yourself with it and drawing that energy into you, you can then push it into your intention. And from there you can go to incredibly elaborate rituals involving all sorts of regalia and different weapons and contacting Enochian entities and so forth. So there's a huge range of different ways in which you can utilize the elements. But just that simple way is very practical and can actually bring about surprisingly strong results. Before I move on to my questions, I just want to mention that there's another aspect of the four elements, and that is practical, specific objects and things that you utilize as physical aspect of a ritual. There are four elemental parts of that. Like for instance, there are a number of operations that involve having earth as a part of it, either putting earth into a bag or a puppet, or making it into a talisman in some way or another. And there are different kinds of earth that you can utilize for that. Also, stones, various stones of different qualities and colors and makeups. And you could even include different sorts of metals in the idea of earth. So earth is the stuff that we make things out of to a large degree, and there are different kinds of earth. There's graveyard earth. There's earth from a bank. There's earth from a church. There's ancestral earth from some property that is associated with our family going back into the ancient times, and various parts of those probably involve making offerings and payments to the spirits of those places. So it's a good idea to have a little bit more knowledge before you start, grabbing graveyard dirt and utilizing it in your rituals. But those the element of earth is a physical object that people often utilize in their magical spells. The element of water, similarly, there are different kinds of water. There's rainwater, there's ocean water, there's holy water. Aaron Leach sells a number of different kinds of holy waters associated with the 7 planets. There's hurricane water. There's water that comes from the sweat of a person that can be gathered and utilized, and the reason for utilizing these various things is the qualities that each kind of water brings into the situation. And sometimes you drink it, sometimes you utilize it to cleanse something, sometimes you utilize it to charge something, depending on the kind of water and what your intentions are with that water. The element of air we actually see in ancient magic a lot more than in modern magic, but the idea of the breath, blowing the breath upon something, is a very powerful aspect of some ancient magics, where we specifically have some intention and we blow it into existence, into our talismanic matters. Also, the incense that various herbs and gums and woods, it creates different atmospheres that we utilize for our magical operations. So that's the element of air. And the element of fire, there's many different kinds of fire. Within alchemy, there's several discussed. there's the solar fire. There's actually multiple kinds of solar fire. There's the fire of the sun itself, which is light, and then there's the solar fire of our spirit body. That's another form of fire. There's lightning created fire that's gathered from a lightning strike that has, and this form of fire is considered to be very powerful in certain forms of magic. Then there's fires that are inside of us: the digestive fire, the sexual fire, the spiritual fire. Then there's candles of various colors and substances that produce different kinds of fire, each of which have a different function within magic. So the four elements are very important in a very practical sense within the objects that we use for our magic. Not just those elemental weapons, but also the various components of our spells. I didn't mention it, but also herbs and various things can also be considered different forms of earth. So I received a number of questions on the subject of the four elements, and I'm just going to answer them fairly quickly because most of them are questions that are not ones that I can answer with a really definitive answer. It's more of a matter of this is a subject for different opinions. And that's one of the things about the four elements is that because they're so simple, there's only four of them, there are a lot of different ways of dividing them up and interpreting them. It's not necessarily as cut and dried as it might seem. So this is the first question is, Frater UD suggests that we use the element of air for money rather than earth because modern currency is not linked to coins and gold. What do you think of that? And so, I would say that's very appropriate for things like maybe like Bitcoin or any kind of cryptocurrency that really has nothing to do with anything other than just ideas and the flow of thoughts. I think that there still is a place for the coin in magic, and I think that the element of earth to me is often represented as a coin because I do a lot of work with the tarot, and so that coin is a coin to me in a lot of ways, and in a lot of the depictions of the tarot it is as well. So I'm probably going to personally stick with money as the element of earth, but I can see that idea being useful in some contexts. Certainly for things like investments and stuff like that, I could see incorporating elements of the element of air into it, just because that's more going to be about head-oriented mental things to do with the air, as much as it is to do with the physical coins. Our way of interacting with wealth and money certainly has changed and become more ephemeral than it used to be. You used to have a pile of gold if you wanted to be rich, and now you can have an idea and it can make you rich. So I see it, but at the same time, on a metaphysical level, I'm still sticking with the idea of the coin. This brings up the subject of the four elemental creatures: the gnomes, the sylphs, the undines, and the salamanders. And one of the ways in which we interact with the gnomes is to sort of mentally utilize the idea of the coins for them to bring them to us. And so, again, I think that the gnomes working in the earth, digging up that ore, for me is a metaphor that is much more meaningful than the sylphs dancing in the air, playing music, and so forth. And that just seems more to do with wealth. Perhaps I'm just being an antiquated old eon person in thinking that, but that's just the way that I feel. But like I said, I can see doing it the other way too, and explore both. So the second question, This is sort of tangentially related to the elements because I think when he's talking about Earth here, he's actually talking about the planet Earth. But I'm going to talk about it for a second anyway. If you had to link the Earth or Malkuth to one of the 7 planets due to its not having a planetary day, any idea what it would be? Or would it just be any day in time? I'm possibly thinking of Venus or Saturn. Then he says, same with spirit. Could it be Sol or Saturn or just East as a place of light? Okay, so he's asking about the element of Earth or the planet Earth and the element of spirit and where you would place them, what day you would work with them on, what hour you would work with them on. And again, this is a matter that really has to do with the early thing that I mentioned before, which is that people didn't really do practical magic with the 4 elements as much in the past, so there isn't as established a track for this. Now, my initial thought for a direction for Earth would just be to utilize Saturn, even the planet Earth, because Saturn is considered this heavy planet and associated with lead and et cetera, and so on. However, for both the planet Earth and the element of Earth, if you look in Agrippa, if you look at the scale of 4 in Agrippa, the planet that's associated with the element of Earth is actually the moon. And the reason for that is that basically the practical spirits of the world, the Earth was here and the moon was here in their idea, and then, after that is Mercury, and then after that is Venus, and then the sun, and, they're all circulating around the world. This space between the moon and the Earth is where most of your spirits actually dwell, and all the practical stuff of magic takes place in there. So the idea that, the moon and the Earth are somewhat connected together as being sort of the housing space of all of those spirits is the reason why it's associated that way in there. So I think that if you're doing an Earth-related operation, you could actually do it related to the moon. And here's another way of approaching that, which I think is even more useful and is actually somewhat mentioned in the Key of Solomon, I believe, which is that a way of working with the elements, any element, not just the Earth, and whichever element you're wanting to work with it at a time in which the moon is in one of those signs. So, for instance, if you're wanting to work with the element of water, you'd have Scorpio or Cancer or Pisces as your, if the moon is in any one of those signs, that's a good time to be working with the element of water. The Golden Dawn, from an influence from one of their more theosophical members, actually published a document in which you would take some things that were markers that were representative of the elements and stick them in a pocket and pull whichever one out, and whichever one came out, that would mean that was the time of that particular tatwa of the element, and then you just cycle through from that way forward for the rest of the day, knowing that you were in the right space for those things. That's another way of approaching it. And so that in that you could associate your times in there. However, ultimately, I think that probably that's somewhat unnecessary. I would focus in on the moon being in a sign that is appropriate to your particular aspect of the element that you're wanting to work with. For instance, and so in order to really utilize my advice, you have to look a little bit more into astrology. I know some people aren't that into astrology, but I think it's useful for timing your magic in some ways. So if you're doing fire magic to improve your will or improve your go get up and go, you'd probably want to go with Aries as opposed to Sagittarius, who is more about sort of philosophical fire. Aries is more about that like penetrating, piercing fire. So not only would you want to utilize one of the signs, you'd want to use the sign that is most appropriate to the specifics of your operation in timing that out. That would just be my suggestion if you're wanting to do that sort of timing. Now, on the other hand, you probably want to choose a day that's also appropriate to what you're doing as well. And so you now the moon moves through all the signs every month, so you have an opportunity to do every month. There will be a space for all 12 signs, and most likely there will be a day that sort of fits with your operation in a nice way. And you can get more into astrological timing if you want to, but when you're dealing with the 4 elements, that's probably enough. Hopefully that answers the question. The other thing about spirit, East as a place of light, I think is okay for spirit. For me personally, I actually utilize the sort of the central column. That doesn't help you with a day, because of the nature of spirit as being sort of the binding aspect of the whole thing. I would say probably no particular day or time is much better than any other. It's just sort of ever present, at least hopefully. So I hope that answers that question. Again, all just my opinion. Is there a shape we should use for talismans related to the elements, like Saturn uses a triangle and Mars a pentagram, etc.? Okay, so this person is basically asking, when you're making a talisman related to one of the planets, there are some shapes that you can utilize. A triangle for Saturn because Saturn is associated with the number 3, a pentagram for Mars because Mars is associated with the number 5, hexagram for the Sun because it's associated with the number 6, yada yada yada. There is a Golden Dawn order document that talks about various ways in which you can utilize different kinds of different forms of the different shapes for different purposes, and some of those might help you a little bit in terms of shapes to utilize. I know the unicursal hexagram is utilized specifically as an elemental hexagram within that document. However, I think that the shapes that are associated with them alchemically are pretty potent symbols at this point, and additionally, you could utilize the tattva symbols, which are the from Tantra, which are the square shape for Earth, the yellow square for Earth, the silver crescent for water, the blue circle for air, and the red triangle for fire, which is interesting. If that's the exact same symbol, obviously this red triangle is very archetypal for fire, since it tends to, form up into a point. It makes sense that people would make that association around the world. And of course the cultures did communicate with each other, so it's not it's not entirely out of nowhere. So I would recommend any of those as being useful for elemental talismans. You could also just simply utilize color for the talismans. Very often at this point in my magical career, I utilize objects more than I do paper talismans, although I do a bit of both. But a red stone for fire, a yellow stone for air, or even a blue stone if you like the tattva colors better, etc. Just utilize an object or a color that you associate strongly with the element, and that can be enough for creating a talisman that's elemental. And I believe there was one more question. This is a really interesting question, and I wish I had a definitive answer for this, but sadly I do not. Do the roles or rulerships in the spirit world ever change? Are their appointments eternal? For instance, will Paimon always be the demon ruler of the West, and will Peralta always forever be the king of air? Well, first of all, I do want to mention that Peralta is not technically the king of air. He's technically the king of the sylphs, who are the elemental creatures, but they're not the element itself. I don't want to sound nerdy, but those are two different things, really. Here's my suggestion for you based on this. According to some sources, yes, elementals are not eternal. Demons, I think, are, but elementals are not, and so perhaps there may be a kingship change. However, I want you to think about it this way. If you had a visit from an alien from another planet, and they said to you, "Take me to your leader, George Washington," you would know that they meant that you should take them to whoever the president is at the time that you're watching this video. So, that is, that they would understand what you were saying pretty much universally. You don't need to necessarily get everything right, just as long as it's something that's understandable. So hopefully that is enough of an answer to that question. As for whether they might change or might have already changed, I'd recommend you ask. To make that contact and go and visit and see if things have changed. Another thing related to this is that some people these days will assign, although they're called the kings, they'll assign the two feminine elements of water and earth. They'll call those entities queens rather than kings. And again, people seem to get results with that. So I don't think that there is necessarily a barrier that's going to be created by you thinking of things slightly differently. So anyway, that's it for talking about the 4 elements in general for today. Thank you for taking the time to watch this, and I want you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and if you have any questions about anything related to occultism that you would like to have answered, please feel free to send me a message. I would love to answer your question, and we will talk again soon.